So I think it's 20 after 3. Let me just ask maybe this sort of larger scale question, which is that most of the people in this room are at the front end of this process. And it looks a little intimidating from the front end, at least to me, and I think to the people that I've spoken to. You know, they're looking at a lot of uncertainty, a lot of potentially large costs. You've worked with a bunch of communities who have been at that same place and have made it through to the other side, as I understand it. That is, have gone through the accreditation process, have gone through the repair process, have gone through the process of dealing with encroachments, et cetera. So what would you tell us at the end here? What would you tell us as by way of encouragement, really, that in fact this is possible, and that in fact other communities have been at this same place and have made it through to the other side?
Well, I guess I'd go back to the lessons learned slide, and I'd say that it really requires a shift in your thinking. First of all, we got into the problem we're in for a bunch of reasons, but one of them is that we made the assumption, and I mean we as a society, that when we built these levees, they would never require another dollar or any more attention. And that we found out is wrong. Now, there are changing federal standards and there are changing state standards, but the reality is it's wrong to assume that you can build infrastructure that will never need work again. Roads need work, sewer treatment needs work, water supply needs work, dams fill up. Just be realistic. It's like any other infrastructure. So that's the first place we've made a mistake, and I think the lesson learned there is we have to teach our public that flood protection will never be done. And that's hard for them to hear, but we need to start training the public so that the next generation of people don't have this same conversation 30, 40 years from now. Second is, I didn't bring this slide. I didn't bring this slide, but there's a slide in California. The Public Policy Institute of California did a study looking at what the average consumer pays for water supply, sewer treatment, and flood protection. And when you see the graph, as you might expect, water is at the top if it's a bar graph, right? And then sewer is almost at the top if it's a bar graph, vertical bar graph. And flood protection, it looks just like a line. It's so flat. There's just no money spent by the average person on it. And it makes sense from the perspective that people drink water every day and use their toilets every day, so they're more connected to it. But we've got to teach the public that not only are you never done, but this costs money. And we've got to get people out of the notion of thinking that there's no investment required. So I guess those are big mind shifts that have to occur. And then for the community, if you accept that we're never done and it's going to take more money, then it shouldn't be this monumental thing, oh my God, I got to get the project done. It's just the next step. It's just that your last step was 40 years ago and someone who's now dead took it. But you're just the next step, and there will be another generation after you that will take the step. So don't get depressed. There will be consequences of failure. Those consequences might be that you have a community that can't build for several years because you're in an A zone, or you have a community that has to pay flood insurance. And that's just a consequence of not getting it done as fast as you'd like to. But that doesn't mean you can't still get it done. So if you form good coalitions and you have good communication and you work with your partners who are out there and you educate each other and you do a mind shift with the public, I think you can get it done. So that you should be able to do that by the end of the week. Or next week, maybe.
We'll remember that.
That's on tape, right?
Yeah. Well, there we go.
Chris Fick with Maloma County. You've spoken pretty highly about California's commitment and the reasons why they've become committed to funding levees. Could you talk a little bit more about the projects that you worked on, what that split has looked like, how the state has divvied up resources, and what communities down there have asked for, could expect, and what the criteria is when the state is awarding funding?
Yeah, the state created some set criteria. And if you go back a number of years, the federal government traditionally had a 70-30 split, where the federal government's share would be 70% and the state share would be 30%. And so in our Central Valley, for the reason that I told you that the state was in this odd situation, the state said, hey, that's a great idea. We'll do a 70-30 split, state 70%, locals 30%. And so when the Corps would come along to do a project and say, state, are you interested? The state would turn to the locals and say, locals, are you interested? Locals would say yes, state would say yes. State would pay 70 and say 30 to the state, excuse me, Corps would pay 70 and say 30 to the state. State would take its 30 and divide it up 70-30. So what you ended up with was feds paying 65 or 70%, cost shares change over time. State paying 20, 25%, locals paying 9 or 10%. So that was the model we were in before all this happened. And as everyone knows, context determines your future. And it's where you come from determines where you end up going. So when we decided to move out of the federal model as our exclusive model and develop projects locally, the state said, well, how are we going to do cost share? And what the state initially said is 70% state share is a lot unless we're getting the behavior we want from our locals. And so we're going to set a minimum state cost share of 50%, and then we're going to do sweeteners up to 70%. So if you are incorporating habitat, we'll give you 5%. If you're protecting state infrastructure, we'll give you 5%. And there were a series of factors like that. And that became the standard for several years. When we got this $5 billion bond passed in 2008, the state said, we really need to think about how we do this. But they stuck with that same basic structure and talked about the sweeteners. And the main sweeteners that the state did was it said, if you're protecting state transportation, we're going to give you additional money, because if the levee fails, the state's going to have to fix the transportation anyway, so it's worth investing in. The state said, if you're going to do habitat, we're going to give you more money. Importantly, the state said, if you're a disadvantaged community, we're going to give you more money as well. And the state defined disadvantaged community under federal low-income standards. And there's this program that you can buy online. You buy it from a company. I guess if you do enough projects in HUD-type areas, there's this complicated formula that looks at what your community income standards are, and then you get additional federal grants based on that. And so this formula can be applied in this context. And the state said, we're going to look, and for the poorest communities, we're going to give more state money because it's an appropriate environmental justice value to fund these communities. And if you're rich daddy warbucks, we're not going to give you as much money. And so that became a new standard as well that's in there. And so for California, generally it's 50 to 70% the state's providing. Where there's disadvantaged communities, the percentage can go higher. And then in really rural communities, the percentage can go as high as 90%. Because the state said, as a practical matter, these rural communities just can't generate enough dollars. Now in California, it's motivated significantly by the state not wanting to be liable from a failure. So that doesn't necessarily mean those percentages would apply within Oregon, but the notion of a sliding scale and the state picking out what's important to it from a values perspective, I think is a great model.
Great.
I actually have a comment. It's for the overall group, and you rarely get through a sentence without using the state as an example partner in the process. And we've been very fortunate to have Christine as a partner at DLCD, but yes, you have no money. And what we've seen in the state of Washington is also similar. Then when you talk about partnerships, it talks about the state of Washington being a partner in the process. I think that, part of the reason we asked for today, and I say we meaning the local districts and Oregon Solutions, was we were getting some great information from Scott and Miller Nash and others, and certainly wanted to share that. I think the other reason is because we have a legislative session coming up, and I think we have to start asking ourselves, what is the role of the state in Oregon? And should there be a more robust role? And it's probably going to be a lot more responsive. The state as an entity is probably going to be a lot more responsive if we as a group are asking for what that role should be, as opposed to just us in Portland or just in Reedsport or Warrenton. So from a timing perspective, I keep hearing you talking about partnerships, and the state is almost every other word. And I think we need to start thinking about how can we as a state of Oregon benefit most by creating partnerships and looking at what the future looks like in the state of Oregon.
I think it's a great comment, and we couldn't have done what we have achieved without the state of California as a partner. And the state was motivated, as I said, in our case. But I suspect that if you sat down and figured out all the areas where the state currently funds stuff in your districts, not necessarily your district activities, but to your communities, your cities, to your counties, et cetera, and you just made a list of what all those things are that the state funds, and then you looked at flood protection as itself on its own list, and you compared them, you would not find a lot of differentiation between flood protection and the things that the state thinks are important. The state tends to think that public health and safety is important. It tends to give money out for that. It tends to give money out where there's economic development opportunities. It tends to give it out for several other reasons. Well, public health and safety and economic development are fundamental bases for flood protection. No offense to the Corps, but the Corps is not in this for flood protection. The Corps is in it for economic development. That was the original Corps mission. That's why the common standard that the Corps is mandated to use by Congress is the National Economic Development Plan. What's the plan that generates the maximum amount of economic development for our nation? And so the notion that the state would fund some things and not fund others, I think is less that the state is opposed to funding flood protection and more that they haven't had to. And if you start comparing, you may find that the state is motivated to help out.
I might add to Reed's comment that another state partner on our project here in the Portland area certainly was Lynn Schessler and IFA and the Regional Solutions Center in helping us put together the funding for the study itself, which would not have happened without them.